The question he was asked that night wasn't "Who are you?" It was "What are you doing here?" And the woman who asked it said it with her eyes, long before she said it with her mouth. The annual gala for the Hartwell Foundation was the kind of event that existed to remind people of the distance between themselves and everyone else. It was held every November at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto, that old stone building on Front Street that had been hosting the powerful and the privileged since before most of the guests' grandparents were born. The chandeliers in the ballroom were original. The carpet had been replaced 3 times, but matched the same pattern. The dress code was black tie. The guest list was curated. And the donations, which were announced one by one over a microphone, were met with applause that rose in direct proportion to the number of zeros. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of room where a man like Ezra Mensah was not supposed to exist. He arrived at 7:15, slightly before the cocktail hour reached its peak, wearing a charcoal suit that was neither flashy nor cheap. He had not brought a +1. He had not called ahead. He checked in at the registration table with a small, unhurried smile, gave his name to the young woman with the clipboard, and waited while she scrolled through the list with 2 fingers. She found it. She looked up, she looked back down, as if double-checking something she couldn't quite believe. "Mr. Mensah? That's right. You're at table 4, thank you," he said and moved into the room. He did not move like a man who was nervous. He moved like a man who had learned, a long time ago, that the only way to survive rooms like this one was to take up exactly as much space as you needed and no more. Not to shrink, not to perform, not to explain yourself before anyone asked. He got a glass of sparkling water from the bar and stood near the window, looking out at the November dark over the city. The CN Tower was lit in orange and red. Below it, the expressway moved in slow, steady lines of white and red light. Ezra watched it the way he always watched things he found beautiful, quietly, without making it into anything more than what it was. He had grown up 40 minutes east of this building in a 2-bedroom apartment in Scarborough that his mother had kept immaculate through a combination of discipline and pride. She cleaned other people's houses 5 days a week. She made jollof rice on Sundays. She kept a photograph of her mother's house in Accra above the kitchen table and told her children that education was the one thing no one could take from you once you had it. Ezra had taken her at her word. He had a PhD in corporate finance from the University of Toronto. He had spent 8 years at a private equity firm in London before returning to Canada to help build something he actually believed in. He had been, for the past 2 years, the silent majority shareholder of Aldridge Capital, the investment group that had, 6 weeks ago, completed a quiet acquisition of the Hartwell Foundation's primary financial partner. Tonight was the first time he would be in the same room as the Foundation's executive team. He had not announced himself in advance. He had wanted to see how the organization actually worked when it thought no one was watching. So far, it was instructive. Her name was Sabrina Elliot, and she had been the Hartwell Foundation's chief executive officer for 11 years. She was 53 years old, tall, and moved through rooms the way people moved, who had spent decades being the most important person present. Her dress was midnight blue. Her hair was silver at the temples in the specific way that signaled choice rather than oversight. She wore a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her mother-in-law, and that she touched once at the base of her throat before she began to work the room. Sabrina Elliot knew how to work a room. That was not nothing. She remembered names, made eye contact at the right moments, laughed with her whole chest when something was genuinely funny, and with a smaller, controlled version of that laugh when it wasn't. She thanked major donors with a specificity that made them feel seen. She steered conversations away from controversy with the practiced grace of someone who had been doing it for so long it had stopped feeling like effort. She was, by every visible metric, exceptional at her job. She was also the kind of person who had learned to read a room in a very particular way, who belonged, who mattered, who was safe to ignore, and who had never examined that skill closely enough to understand what it actually was. When she first noticed Ezra Mensah, it was at the edge of her vision. A man standing alone near the window, charcoal suit, glass of water, no one talking to him. Her attention slid past him. He was not someone she recognized. The first time it happened, it could have been an accident. Ezra had moved from the window toward the cluster of round tables at the center of the ballroom, and he'd passed close to Sabrina and the small group she was holding court with. A city councilor, 2 foundation board members, and a woman who ran a large charitable endowment out of Mississauga. Ezra paused at the edge of their circle. He extended his hand toward Sabrina with the natural ease of a man who had shaken hands in 1,000 rooms. Sabrina was mid-sentence. She let his hand hang there for a moment. Then she turned, deliberately, back toward the counselor. The conversation continued. The hand came down. Ezra nodded once, to no one in particular, and moved on. There was a young woman nearby, one of the Foundation's junior communications coordinators, there to manage social media coverage, who had watched the whole thing. Her name was Petra Voss, and she was 26 years old and had been at the Hartwell Foundation for 8 months. And she had spent those 8 months learning which instincts at this job she was allowed to trust and which she was supposed to ignore. She watched Ezra Mensah lower his hand and felt something tighten in her chest. She almost said something. She didn't. The second time was not an accident. Ezra had crossed the room to the bar, where Sabrina had stopped to pick up a fresh glass of white wine. He stepped up beside her, and because the moment was natural, because they were both simply 2 people waiting at the same bar, he turned to her and said, "Good evening." She looked at him. There was a fraction of a second, barely long enough to name, where something moved across her face. Then she picked up her glass, said something brief to the bartender about the temperature of the room, and walked away. Ezra stood at the bar for a moment. He set his glass down on the counter. He looked at it. Then he picked it up again and turned back toward the room. A man named Douglas Ossie, a Toronto-based philanthropist who had known Ezra for 11 years and who was one of the only people in the room who knew exactly who Ezra was, had seen the exchange from across the room. He started to move in Ezra's direction. Ezra caught his eye and gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Douglas stopped. He understood. The third time was the one that the room would remember. By 9 o'clock, the cocktail hour had ended and the formal program had begun. The tables were full. The Foundation's chair, a retired judge named Harvey Alderton, who was 70 years old and had the quiet, enormous authority of someone who had stopped needing to prove anything decades ago, was speaking from the podium at the front of the room. He was thanking the major donors. He was talking about the Foundation's impact over the past year. 14,000 families served, 11 new community partnerships, a new bursary program for first-generation university students launching in January. Ezra listened carefully. He made mental notes of the things that were true, and the things that were polished to sound true, but were slightly more complicated than that. At the break between Harvey Alderton's speech and the seated dinner, Sabrina Elliot moved through the tables, greeting guests. She was working her way around the room systematically, pausing at each table, dropping a word or two for the people she knew. She reached table 4. Ezra stood. It was a simple gesture, the kind of thing you did when someone approached your table. He stood and he turned to face her, and he extended his hand. The table went still. There were 6 other people at table 4. A couple from Oakville who donated every year, a professor from Ryerson, a woman who ran a youth outreach program in Regent Park, and 2 people from the Foundation's development team. They all saw it. Sabrina Elliot looked at the extended hand. She looked at Ezra's face. And it was deliberate. It was completely deliberate. There was no other word for what it was. She turned to the woman seated to Ezra's left and said brightly, "Patricia, I'm so glad you could make it this year. How is the outreach program going?" The woman named Patricia looked startled. She said something polite. The conversation moved. Ezra remained standing for 3 full seconds, long enough for everyone at the table to understand what had just happened, long enough for it to be impossible to explain away. Then he sat down. He picked up his fork. He looked at the menu card on his plate. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look angry. He looked, the woman from the youth outreach program would later tell her colleague, like someone doing a kind of math, like someone calculating the precise weight of what had just happened and where to store it. It was Patricia Donnelly, the woman from Regent Park, who spoke first. She waited until Sabrina had moved to the next table, and then she leaned forward slightly and said, in a low voice, "I'm sorry about that. That was." She stopped. She didn't know how to finish the sentence without saying exactly what she thought, and she wasn't sure this was the room for it. "Don't worry about it," Ezra said. "Are you a first-time guest this year?" "I am. Do you have a connection to the foundation?" He looked up from the menu. "You could say that." She waited for more. He smiled briefly and turned the menu card over in his hands. "The bursary program," he said. "For first-generation students. Have you heard the details?" "A little. Harvey mentioned it just now." "It's a good program," Ezra said. "I was a first-generation student. At U of T, my mother cleaned houses on Danforth." He said it without drama, the way you state a fact that is simply true. "I had one scholarship that covered tuition and another that covered nothing else, and I spent the first 2 years of my degree eating mostly toast and working 12 hours a week at a warehouse in Etobicoke to cover the gap." He set the menu down. "A bursary program with the funding this one has, it could change the shape of someone's entire life." Patricia Donnelly looked at him. "What do you do now?" He smiled again, just slightly. "Finance." The dinner passed. The speeches resumed. There was a live auction that raised $340,000 in 40 minutes, and Sabrina Elliott's team coordinated it with the smooth efficiency of a machine that had been well maintained for a long time. Ezra bid on one item, a week at a lake house in Muskoka, and won it with a single raised hand and a calm nod when the bidding hit $60,000. It created a ripple through the room. People at nearby tables glanced over. The woman next to Patricia whispered something to her husband. Sabrina Elliot, standing near the auction podium, turned at the sound of the room's reaction. She looked at the man at table 4, who had just dropped $60,000 into her foundation's budget with the ease of someone paying for parking. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to her team. At 10:15, Harvey Alderton returned to the podium for a brief closing address. He thanked the staff. He thanked the guests. He thanked the donors. He mentioned that there was one announcement he had saved until the end of the evening, because it was the kind of news that deserved, in his words, to be the last thing people remembered. He looked out over the room, and his eyes found Ezra Mensah at table 4. 6 weeks ago, Harvey said, Aldridge Capital completed its acquisition of our primary financial partner, Meridian Group. This is, for our organization, the most significant development in the last decade. It changes the scope of what we can do. It changes the scale. And it means that the person who now holds the deciding voice in how this foundation is resourced and directed is someone new to many of you in this room. He paused. "I'd like to introduce him, Ezra Mensah. Would you stand?" Ezra stood. The room turned. The applause began. A little uncertain at first. The way applause is when people are still recalibrating, and then fuller, and then quite loud. Because Harvey Alderton was standing at the podium with his hands coming together, and when a man like Harvey Alderton led the clapping, you followed. Ezra nodded once, acknowledged the room, and sat back down. Patricia Donnelly beside him laughed quietly, not unkindly. "Finance," she said. "Finance," he agreed. 3 tables away, Sabrina Elliot did not move. She had the expression of a person who is running a very fast and very private calculation and has just arrived at an answer they do not like. Her wine glass was in her hand. She was still holding it the same way she'd been holding it when Harvey had started speaking, and she had not yet thought to set it down. Her deputy, a careful man named Owen Chen, who had worked alongside her for 6 years and knew her better than almost anyone, was standing close enough to see her face. He would think about this moment later. He would think about the specific sequence: the man at the window, the hand at the bar, the hand at table 4, and now this. And he would understand, with a clarity that made him deeply uncomfortable, that Sabrina had not seen Ezra Mensah all evening because she had not been capable of seeing him. Not the way she needed to see people. Not as someone whose presence required explanation. He had simply not registered, and now he was the most important person in the room. She came to him at the end of the evening. Most of the guests were collecting their coats, finding their cars, saying their goodbyes in the long, unhurried way of people who have spent a pleasant evening together and are reluctant to let it end. Ezra was speaking with Douglas and a woman from the foundation's board, and he saw Sabrina approaching from 12 feet away. He had time to prepare his face, and he chose to prepare it as nothing in particular, not warm, not cold, simply present. Mr. Mensah. She said it with both formality and the particular quality of someone reaching for ground they're not sure will hold. I'm Sabrina Elliot. I'm the CEO of the Hartwell Foundation. I want to welcome you to the evening, and I'd love the opportunity to speak with you sometime about the Foundation's direction going forward. She extended her hand. Ezra looked at it. He looked at it for exactly long enough. Not a punishing silence, just enough that she could hear, in that silence, the sound of her own hand hanging in the air 3 times that evening, unreturned. Then he shook it, once briefly, professionally. Mrs. Elliot, he said, I hope you had a good experience tonight. I know it was your first time with us. It was informative, he said. She waited for more. He didn't offer it. I look forward to building a strong relationship with you and your team, she said. She had a remarkable ability to continue on the surface of things. I'm sure you do, Ezra said. He held her gaze for a moment. I'll have my office send over the preliminary governance review early next week. There are some structural conversations we'll need to have. Something moved across her face. Of course. Good evening, Miss Elliot. He turned back to Douglas, and the conversation resumed. Sabrina walked back toward the far side of the room, where Owen Chen was waiting for her with her coat. How did it go? He asked. She didn't answer right away. She stood there for a moment, holding the coat he'd handed her, not putting it on. He's going to restructure us, she said. Owen nodded slowly. Probably. Did you know who he was before tonight? Owen looked at her steadily. I'd heard the name. I didn't put it together until Harvey announced it. She nodded. She was quiet for another moment. Did you see? She stopped. Yes, Owen said. She didn't ask what he meant. They both knew. She put her coat on and went to say goodnight to Harvey Alderton. 3 weeks later, Ezra Mensah arrived at the Hartwell Foundation's offices on Bay Street for the first of what would be several governance meetings. Petra Voss was at the reception desk when he came in. She was the young communications coordinator who had watched the whole sequence at the Gala, the first hand, the bar, the table, and had not said anything, and had thought about that choice for most of the past 3 weeks. She stood when he approached. Mr. Mensah, welcome. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? He set his bag down on the chair beside reception and gave her the same unhurried smile he'd given the woman at the registration table 3 weeks ago. Water would be great, thanks. She went to get it. When she came back, he was looking at the framed photos on the wall. The Foundation's history displayed in chronological order, beginning with a black and white photo from 1974 and moving forward decade by decade. First-generation bursary program, she said, handing him the glass. It launches in January. There was a lot of internal back and forth about whether the funding was there, but... She stopped herself. Sorry, I don't know why I'm telling you that. He looked at the photograph in front of him. Because you care about it, I do. He glanced at her, then back at the wall. What's your name? Petra Voss. He nodded. Ms. Voss, the funding is there. He picked up his bag. Who do I check in with for the meeting? She pointed him toward the boardroom and watched him go. This man who had stood with his hand out 3 times in one evening and had not once let his face betray what it cost him. And she thought that she understood now something she hadn't understood before. Dignity wasn't the absence of anger. It was knowing exactly where to put it. The governance review took 5 weeks. It was thorough and it was uncomfortable, and it surfaced a number of things about the foundation's internal culture that had been present for a long time without anyone having the standing or the will to name them. Sabrina Elliot was not dismissed. That was not the kind of story this was. She was given a choice: undergo a significant restructuring of her role, more accountability to the board, a new deputy with a different mandate, a formal equity audit of the foundation's hiring and promotion practices, or step down. She was given 2 weeks to decide. She called Ezra's office on the first day of the second week. "I'll stay," she said. "Good," he said. "That's the right decision for the organization." There was a pause. "I want to say something, okay, at the gala." Another pause. Longer. "I'm not sure I don't have an excuse for how I behaved. I don't want to offer one. I just want you to know that I've been thinking about it for 5 weeks and I know what it was, and I'm sorry." Ezra was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Elliot," he said, "you've been running this organization for 11 years. You have done good work. You have also carried some things in the way you work that are going to have to change. The apology is noted. What matters now is what comes next." She said she understood. He believed her, partially. That was honest. The bursary program launched in January as scheduled. The first cohort was 43 students from across Ontario. From Scarborough, from Regent Park, from Sudbury, from Thunder Bay, from a small reserve north of Kenora, where the nearest university was 4 hours away. And the idea of 4 years of tuition had never been something a person from there was supposed to feel entitled to want. Ezra Mensah did not speak at the launch event. He stood near the back of the room. In the same unhurried way, he stood near windows, and he watched the students come in and look at the room around them, that specific look which he recognized in his body before he recognized it in his mind, of a person who has arrived somewhere they were told in 100 different quiet ways was not meant for them. He knew that look. He had worn it once. He watched it move across 43 young faces, and then, one by one, become something else. A woman from Thunder Bay sat down in the front row and pulled out a notebook and opened it to the first page and wrote something at the top. He couldn't see what it was from where he was standing. He didn't need to.